What if I told you that everything we know about modern civilization, cities, governments, religion, warfare, and even economic inequality, can trace its roots back to one single period in human history? A time when humans weren't just surviving, but reshaping the world around them. This wasn't some age of kings or empires, but a revolution born of mud, stone, and grain. In the second chapter of our journey through the Neolithic Age, we dive deeper into the silent chaos of early farming villages, the rise of power and superstition, and how simple grains planted in the dirt would ultimately create borders, armies, and class systems. This is the moment when humanity stepped beyond nature, and began to dominate it. But that victory came with a cost. And the seeds of that cost were planted long before anyone knew what civilization truly meant. As the Neolithic Age progressed, the changes that began with basic agriculture and early settlement deepened into full-scale cultural transformation. The land was no longer just something humans lived on, it became something they owned, defended, and organized their lives around. Fields were measured, boundaries were drawn, and surplus crops were stored and redistributed, often not equally. And just like that, the earliest systems of social hierarchy began to form. Within these expanding villages, not all work was equal. Those who controlled the food, whether by managing storage, organizing labor, or performing religious rites believed to influence harvests, soon held more power than the rest. This was not a sudden shift but a slow, creeping change. A few people in each settlement began to live slightly better lives, larger huts, more access to meat, perhaps more decorative pottery or clothing. These small differences, repeated over generations, calcified into early class systems. For the first time, inequality became a permanent feature of human life. Religious institutions played a central role in this process. As villages grew and the mysteries of nature, floods, droughts, plagues, and harvest cycles, continued to baffle Neolithic people, spiritual explanations grew more elaborate. Shamans and early priests claimed to intercede with gods or spirits to ensure successful planting or protection from disaster. With this claimed power came real influence. Sacred spaces were built from timber or stone, evolving into primitive temples. These became the spiritual centers of communities, and often the political ones too. In fact, it's likely that many early leaders claimed both divine favor and material control. This fusion of religion and governance became the basis for proto-theocracies, where power wasn't just earned, it was ordained. We see the physical traces of this in burial sites from the era. Some graves are more lavish than others, containing elaborate tools, ornaments, or even sacrificed animals, clear signs of rising elite classes. Meanwhile, common people were buried with little ceremony, sometimes communally. As social complexity increased, so too did technological innovation. Stone tools grew more specialized, flint sickles for harvesting, grinding stones for processing grain, and polished axes for clearing forests. Pottery became widespread, used not just for storing surplus food, but also for cooking and fermentation. With fire, ceramics, and surplus grain, alcohol brewing became possible, perhaps one of the oldest social rituals in human history. Drinking, gathering, storytelling, these were cultural threads that began to bind Neolithic people together, generation after generation. But growth came with conflict. More people meant more mouths to feed, and more land was needed to farm. This led to disputes between neighboring villages. The earliest skirmishes over territory began, not yet wars as we know them, but ritualized or spontaneous violence that hinted at the coming storm of organized conflict. Weapons improved, and fortifications appeared around some settlements, simple ditches, palisades, or elevated mounds to provide defense. The Neolithic landscape was also marked by extraordinary monument building. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, early humans erected massive stone structures, megaliths, burial cairns, and circles aligned with celestial events. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey and Stonehenge in England suggest highly coordinated labor, spiritual belief systems, and seasonal gatherings. These weren't mere tombs, they were statements of human unity, ambition, and mystery. Trade, too, began to flourish. Obsidian blades from distant volcanoes, seashell jewelry from the coast, and pigments for body paint and ceramics were exchanged over vast distances. This created early economic networks and mutual dependence between regions. From these humble trade routes, the future Silk Roads and spice routes would one day emerge. Daily life, however, was still rooted in intense physical labor. Farming required year-round attention, planting, weeding, guarding from animals, harvesting, threshing, and storing. Women often played crucial roles in agricultural tasks, food preparation, textile weaving, and childcare, while men managed herding, toolmaking, and defense. Yet these roles were not always rigid. The needs of the village came first, and cooperation was essential. Rituals marked the changing seasons. Solstice festivals, fertility rites, and harvest dances brought communities together in celebration and awe. Firelight, music, chanting, and masks gave these gatherings a sacred, theatrical quality. Even as people began to control their environment, they remained deeply connected to nature and the cycles of the earth. Yet beneath the surface, a paradox emerged. The Neolithic Age gave humanity abundance, structure, and security, but also sowed the seeds of inequality, conflict, and overexploitation. Forests were cut at accelerating rates. Rivers were diverted. The first environmental impacts of civilization began. And while some celebrated surplus, others began to suffer under systems that distributed resources unfairly. And then came the final transformation, the birth of proto-cities. Settlements like Catalhoyuk in Anatolia grew far larger than villages, hundreds of homes, tightly packed, with elaborate murals, shrines, and specialized workshops. These weren't yet true cities, but the blueprint was there. Division of labor, urban planning, trade zones, and spiritual quarters, all foreshadowing the dawn of city-states. The Neolithic Age didn't end with a bang, it transitioned slowly into what historians call the Chalcolithic or Copper Age, where metal tools began to replace stone and societies moved toward larger-scale governance. But its legacy is unmistakable. From every city skyline to every loaf of bread, the fingerprints of Neolithic humanity are still with us. They tamed the wild, bent the seasons to their will, and built the frameworks for everything we know today. But they also laid the foundations for the struggles we still face: inequality, environmental degradation, and the eternal tension between progress and harmony with nature. In learning their story, we learn more about ourselves. Because the Neolithic Age wasn't just a chapter in history, it was the moment we became truly human.